There's nothing I love more than authenticity, which is why I'm so excited about Salsa de la Vida hot sauce, which has been on kitchen tables in Mexico since 1956. It will be available here in the U.S. for purchase later this year. In addition to livening up your food, it's Mexican-owned, it's woman-owned, and it's one of the only hot sauce brands to have 100% Mexican-sourced pepper mix. Salsa de la Vida hot sauce will be available here in the United States to purchase on shelves later this year. Hey there, I'm Lezli Levine Harvell. Welcome to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. I believe the best way to explore a topic in depth is to view it through multiple lenses. Join us as we explore race, culture, and societal issues through the lens of industry experts, writers, cultural critics, and HBCU students. This is part 2 of IDE's Impolite Conversation on country music entitled The Meticulous Architecture of the Country Music Myth, with Dr. Charles L. Hughes, author of Country Soul, Making Music and Making Race in the American South, director of the Lynne and Henry Turley Memphis Center at Rhodes College, and assistant professor of urban studies, history, and Africana Studies. It was recorded on December 11th, 2020, prior to the transition of country music legend and country music's first major Black star, Charley Pride. In 1967, Charley's recording of Just Between You and Me became a top 10 hit on Billboard's country music charts. 51 more of his recordings reached the country top 10. Last month, he received the Country Music Association's Lifetime Achievement Award. It was his last public performance. Charley Pride passed away due to complications related to COVID-19 on December 12, 2020. He was 86 years old. 2 Mondays ago, we chatted about the fact that Adele and Jasmine Sullivan could sing the exact same song. Adele would get the designation of pop. Jasmine Sullivan would get the designation of R&B. I saw Ray Charles come up as a country singer. In addition to Ray Charles, are there other people that you think have gotten placed in one category, but you would consider them a country singer based off of the defining characteristics of the country?
Absolutely. And yes, I would consider Ray Charles a country singer for sure. He's also an R&B singer. He's also a pop. And I think Charles himself would probably say that a lot of what he's doing, even if it sounds more bluesy or whatever, that a lot of it's rooted in part, at least in country music, which he loved. I think there are absolutely a whole history of Black musicians who were not marketed as country because they were Black. Basically, that was the only reason. And it wasn't that they couldn't be marketed in other spaces too, but it's the Adele, Jasmine Sullivan thing, where Adele can be in several categories at once, whereas someone like Jasmine Sullivan singing the very same kind of thing, it's not going to be as easy for her to be allowed into those spaces. So I think a lot about people who we would classify for very good reason as R&B and soul singers, but who also thought of themselves as being at least sometimes country singers when they would sing a country song or when they would do something that was really deep in that kind of tradition. And if you go back and look at the 60s and 70s, which is really one of the great kind of golden ages for R&B, basically every prominent R&B artist, with only a couple exceptions, recorded at least one country song. And many of them recorded entire albums. And that in part is because of Ray Charles's success when he records an album in the early 60s called Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music, which I love that title because it's Ray Charles, and on the cover he's wearing a tuxedo. He's looking like Ray Charles. He's not dressed up in a cowboy suit or anything. And he calls it Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music, which is, I would interpret it as him saying like, okay, I'll show you where this is headed, right? I'll give you some modern country and Western music. And the songs themselves, they're beautiful and they're very faithful, but they're also his own kind of arrangement. And that album becomes a huge success, like an unprecedented success. Although it didn't initially have a lot of support from the Nashville industry because it wasn't recorded there and because he was Black, you know, very similar to the Lil Nas X story in a lot of ways. But in the aftermath of that success, you have full albums of country songs recorded by everyone from Brooke Benton to the Supremes to Joe Tex, to Bobby Womack and Millie Jackson. Tina Turner did a country album. In fact, her first solo album was a country album, which is really interesting. So a lot of Black singers would assert their kind of country bona fides and sing this stuff and make just these wonderful recordings, not as a way to say, I'd rather be a country singer, but to say, I've always been country and I've been these other things and you won't allow me to do it. And you hear that story over and over again. You hear it from stars, people like Millie Jackson or people like...
I would even say to some extent, Beyonce has delved into that as well.
She totally has. And she gets it, right? Like she clearly gets the history. You know, she's Texan and she performed with, well, they were then the Dixie Chicks, now the Chicks. They've dropped Dixie from their name.
I was going to bring it up. I didn't want to delve too into that, but yeah. Like,
yeah. And
Lady Antebellum and all that. I'm like, does everyone know what antebellum means? Okay, because I think everyone does. Why is everyone cool? Oh, because they're country singers.
Exactly. Yep.
You know what I mean? And like even the Dixie Chicks. I thought Dixie was like a nickname for Antebellum South. That's what I thought. So I'm like, everybody's just cool with that name? Like, what's going on?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And it relates back to what you were talking about before, right? Where
yes.
on some level, and you are not wrong to think that. But what I wanted to just quickly say about Beyonce also is that one of the things that I think made that performance with the Chicks so powerful was that it was speaking not just to Beyonce's love of country music, which she has, but also speaking to the ways that she understands herself as part of a tradition that goes back and forth. And that's because the Chicks too understand why Beyonce matters. And there's the great scholar Tawana Steptoe has written about Beyonce and Texas and Houston, and the way in which that is very reflective of Texas, but also very reflective of this deeper story that we just don't get told. And Beyonce and the Chicks were basically saying, okay, we are going to use our prominence in this moment to say that this idea that people have about country being a white thing is just wrong. I think that the crucial thing really is that for decades and decades and decades and decades, it was extremely difficult, if not impossible, for a Black performer to be given a shot. It's not like we're trying to get into this space because we just want to be part of the white people's party.
They're like, this
right.
music too.
This is our space. Yeah, this is our space. The albums I was talking about, they're all called things like My Country or just country or soul country. They're all very explicitly saying, we are part of this. And I think that's really important because it's such a deeply Black form, but it is also something that Black folks have continued to listen to, even when the industry and politicians and just people have done everything possible to prevent that or to make that seem like it doesn't happen. And it's a really remarkable demand that is, I think, a really powerful example of how culture can be political. And it goes back a long way.
Yes. And then also, to your point, Charley Pride. In his biography, there's a very famous excerpt from that where he says that one of his very prominent white colleagues says to him, like, oh, it's so great to have you in our music. And he said back to him, well, it's my music too.
Absolutely. That's such a powerful moment because Charley Pride is in his career trying constantly to negotiate an incredibly narrow entryway. People at the time were very hopeful or scared, depending on what they felt, but they were very hopeful that the success of Charley Pride was going to lead to this broader renaissance of opportunity for Black country singers or Black singers who wanted to do a country album. And there were certainly quite a few Black country artists who were signed after he broke through. Because if nothing else, the recording industry loves success and they'll try to drive it into the ground no matter what genre. But absolutely nobody following Charley Pride had anywhere near his level of success. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And they're dependent on the individual artists. But they should have had more success than they did. And Pride is trying desperately to be non-controversial because everybody knows that he can't be. I don't even know how controversial he wanted to be. But he knows that he can't. It's pure Du Boisian double consciousness, right? It's pure, like, I have to not only understand myself, but understand how you all see me. Beyond that, of not being controversial, he's also constantly being questioned as to whether or not he belongs. And the ability that he has to do that while maintaining one of the really, like, Charley Pride's music is so elegant and dignified, and there's a stateliness. Even when he's doing kind of a honky-tonk thing, he's such a sort of stately, elegant singer. And it's very hard for me not to listen to these amazing recordings that he made and not really hear miraculous ability that he had to find a way in this extremely difficult circumstance. And then he's the last one until the 90s with Darius Rucker, actually the early 2000s, when Darius Rucker starts to have country hits. There's nobody between Charley Pride and Darius Rucker to have consistent success. There are a few people who break through now and then, and even the Pointer Sisters have a Grammy award-winning country song called Fairy Tale that becomes a chart hit too. But overall, it is a barren field.
As you were talking about how elegant his music was, I don't know anything about his music. I don't know anything about him. And obviously, Black people are not a monolithic group. But I do know that if you're going to enter a white space as a Black person, you already know that they have all of these preconceived notions of you. I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't feel like he needed to be the representative for his entire race. I'm sure it was like a form of activism for him to be so elegant, because he's probably like, I cannot mess anything up for any of these people coming behind me. I don't know him. Again, Black people are not a monolithic group, but that's definitely a thing. It's definitely a thing.
Oh, absolutely. And he's always been very cagey about talking about that side of things, but he's a very smart man. And I'm sure he was aware of that. And he was certainly acting in a way that I think is definitely a part of that. And he came in for some criticism at the time, because this is the late 60s and early 70s. So he was getting criticism from sort of, white racists and people who were very, very dubious of this whole thing of him coming onto the Grand Ole Opry and other places. But he also came in for critique from Black Power and Black arts folks who were saying, basically, you're going in there and I don't know that anybody said you're dancing for white folks, but basically said, what is it that you're doing as a representative in this space that we know to be so deeply racist? Why aren't you building up your community? That kind of classic notion of sort of what is the responsibility of the successful individual to the community, which has been maybe the central dynamic about kind of Black cultural politics from the very beginning because of what you're talking about. So I don't really know how he thought of himself.
The fact that he grew up in Mississippi, he already knows, the language of the Deep South. Absolutely. And how you have to navigate it.
I think you're absolutely right. And it plays out in so many ways that he's contending with the politics of respectability in a way that is complicated because of the deeply self-protective way that he didn't talk about any of this. But it is also, as you say, very clear that he's thinking about it, if nothing else. And white people, they'll always assume that someone like Charley Pride is, being so nice to us because Charley Pride just loves us. When, of course, part of the reason that Charley Pride, who is, whatever, again, not leaving out other parts of his personality, but there's no way that part of what he was doing wasn't, I cannot put myself in danger in spaces that may be literally violent, or at the very least, where I have to contend with my colleagues coming up to me and saying, great to have you here.
With the Pointer Sisters, would you have considered them primarily country?
No, but they loved country and they wanted to do it, right? Thinking about music in particular, white folks get really caught up in the myth of kind of Black musical authenticity. The idea that Black folks are just naturally more musical, or Black folks just have that rhythm, or all of that kind of racist stuff. And that was central to why, even in slavery, white people wanted to hear Black music and didn't want to hear white people play. They wanted to hear, even if it was the same music, like we were talking about before. I think one of the things that's caused and led to is that there has been a historical erasure, not just of Black musical influence, but of Black musical professionalism and training and versatility. There is the sort of racist mythology of this essential musical talent has meant that it's more difficult for Black musicians to be thought of as these sort of trained professionals. So when, for example, someone like Adele or Elvis, or Willie Nelson or anybody that we want to talk about. When Adele does a song that's kind of a dance hall R&B song, and then she turns around and does something that's sort of a torchy ballad, and then she turns around and does something that's got a little kind of maybe country or rock and roll influence, and then she turns and does something that sounds like Aretha Franklin, right? Or Jasmine Sullivan. That's Adele being versatile. That's Adele demonstrating her range. Whereas on the other hand, if Jasmine Sullivan were to do that, I think that historically
people are like, oh, wait a minute,
right.
wait a minute, what you doing? What you doing?
Exactly. Yeah. And it has to be this kind of referendum on her identity, or this referendum on is Jasmine Sullivan staying true to her roots, right? Which is a very complicated thing, because not to make it even further complicated, but at the same time, Black folks, Black political leaders, Black writers, Black musicians, most of all, have claimed Black music as a thing, as something that is real and has a tradition and is something that should be controlled and created by Black people and owned in all senses of the words by Black people. Because white thievery has made that very difficult. It's made it difficult in every respect, and music's one of them. So I'm not trying to totally discount the idea that there is a really important value in saying Black musical traditions deserve to be considered as such. And there's a thing called Black music that Black folks create. And when white folks do it, there's something that is missing or something that is complicated, at least. So I don't mean to say that isn't true, but I do think it's interesting that the versatility of white artists is something that is culturally assumed, whereas the versatility of Black artists, which has always been as not, if not more than white artists, kind of gets forgotten. So I would say that the Pointer Sisters are,
it's a perfect example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, when they want to be country, there's nobody countryer. When they want to be rock and roll, when they want to be gospel drenched, when they want to be funky, right?
Yeah.
Like they are doing it because they love the music and they're synthesizers and they're professionals. And they had great training and practice and experience. And that tends to be the way musicians talk about their work, is as work. It's a craft. They perfected it and they build it. And musicians, if anything unites all musicians, it's that they love music, right? Whatever kind or whatever. So they get to do this thing they love and they get to bring in other influences or whatever.
And this lack of versatility that is not afforded to people other than white artists, you see that in other aspects of culture. For example, take chefs. If you're a white chef, you can have a Mexican restaurant, you can have an Italian restaurant, even if you're not Italian. You could be a sushi chef, all of these things. Absolutely. If you are Black, if you are Latino, if you are Asian, they're like, wait a minute, we need you to only cook those things.
Exactly.
Yeah. You know what I mean? But when you're a white chef, you can do all these other things. More Impolite Conversation in just a moment. The new HBO documentary Yusef Hawkins, Storm Over Brooklyn, tells the story of Yusef Hawkins, a Black teenager who was murdered in 1989 by a group of young white men in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. His death and the official response to it sparked outrage in New York. The film, directed by Muta Ali Muhammad, explores the 30-year legacy of Yusef's murder, and his family and friends reflect on the tragedy and the subsequent fight for justice that inspired and divided New York City. Stream it now on HBO Max. Visit hbomax.com to sign up for your 7-day free trial. So Lil Nas X, his song Old Town Road, was the longest running #1 song in history on Billboard. It's been streamed more than 1 billion times just on Spotify. It debuted on Billboard's cross-genre Hot 100 chart, the Hot Country Songs chart, and the Hot R&B Hip Hop Songs chart all at once. And then Billboard removed Old Town Road from Hot Country Songs and informed Lil Nas X's label, Columbia Records, that his inclusion on the ranking was a mistake. Did Old Town Road include most of the defining characteristics of contemporary country?
Absolutely. Almost every single one. The musical elements, the lyrical elements, it was absolutely in conversation with not only with things that are happening right now in country music, but that have been happening for the last several years.
Okay, what was this really about?
Primarily, it was about race, and it was about his name, the cultural coding of country music. as being a space that is about white folks who are mostly associated with the Nashville recording industry. Here was a guy who comes out of nowhere. I don't know anybody who had heard of him before this all happened. And God bless him. I think he's really tremendous. And I'm so happy for his success and for his continued success. But none of the traditional gatekeepers of country music had anything to do with this, which is itself a racial
problem. That was
exactly. And it's itself a racial question. It's a gender question too. They got real problems with gender, which is a whole other connected conversation. But so he comes out of nowhere. Nobody knows who he is. Nobody in Nashville had anything to do with him. He's got a Gen Z sensibility, both in terms of the music, but also in how he put it out. You know, it's sort of based on this video game thing. And then he goes viral on SoundCloud and TikTok and then gets picked up, right? So it's just this wonderful bit of post-millennial brilliance. And then his name is Lil Nas X. I don't know anything about how it happened at Billboard, but I would not be surprised if they didn't even listen to it when they just saw the name Lil Nas X and Old Town Road and they thought, there's no way. And that's it. That's the history of country music. The country music has always incorporated Black influences, always, from Jimmy Rogers and the Blues through hip hop in the 2010s and even in 2000s. One of the biggest country stars right now is Sam Hunt, and I really like Sam Hunt. Sam Hunt will tell you that he's as influenced by Drake as he is by anybody, and you can hear it, right? So country music has always incorporated Black influences as a centerpiece of its commercial strategy and as a central piece of trying to sound relevant and broaden the audience and demonstrate the creativity of country musicians. At the same time, they have really policed the boundaries and the borders of who gets to be a part of that. So even as it's been racially inclusive in terms of the sound, deeply, deeply so, it has not been so in terms of the race of the artists or the people behind the scenes, etc. And so to me, that's what it was about. It was about a historical boundary policing that Billboard decided needed to be maintained. And I don't know, I really hope eventually at least we get the inside story, because someone had to have made the decision.
According to this article in Rolling Stone, the fact that they said his ranking was a mistake was an anonymous source.
It is so reflective of this broader history. Maybe Nashville companies called them up and were like, hey, you got to do something about this. I wouldn't be surprised, but it's Billboard who makes the decision, which is so perfectly appropriate because Billboard magazine and the charts and the recording industry going back to race records and hillbilly music, they are such a primary reason why we have these racialized borders. That is such a primary reason why we have this idea that white people make a certain kind of music, Black people make a certain kind of music, and never the twain should meet, especially when we're making money, right?
So what does progress look like?
Progress to me looks like a couple of things happening. And I think they have to happen simultaneously. One of them is the further success of Black artists and other people of color on the country charts to better reflect in mainstream commercial country music. And that's true not just of the kind of most pop country stuff, but also the kind of rootsier country scenes, bluegrass and Americana and other things like that. I think it is happening that we are actually starting to get that a bit. We're not just looking at a Charley Pride or a Darius Rucker. We're looking at a Lil Nas X, Jimmy Allen, Kane Brown, Rhiannon Giddens, a Breland, we got a whole crew. And there were others I didn't mention. That's historically unprecedented. That is absolutely unprecedented. And as much as a historian, I get very cynical about the possibility of change. That's pretty incredible. Definitely want more of that. And I want more people to have a consistent career being successful rather than having one hit and then instead of being nurtured back to another hit, being dumped right away, because that's obviously something that happens a lot. Progress also looks on that side like more Black women or more Black non-binary people having success. Just as in every aspect of country music, Black women have had far less opportunity than even the narrow opportunities for Black men. This is a broader gender problem in country right now. It's a big one. And Black women who are speaking to that intersectional situation very specifically. Mickey Guyton, for example, who has been in the Nashville system for years and has never received the shot that she's deserved. She's as radio-friendly mainstream as you can be, and she's put out great singles and great records, and she's just never had a big shot. She's never been supported. And in the past couple of years, I think motivated by what's happened in country, but also motivated by Black Lives Matter and what's been happening in activism, she's begun to speak to this. One of her songs this year is called Black Like Me, which is not only about being Black in the United States, but about being Black in country music. I want more artists. I want conversations between them, just like we would have conversations within the hip hop community. That's such a wonderful thing when we have this internal ecosystem, and it's not just about the one Black artist who had a shot being in the middle of that. That's one thing I want. And the other thing I want is I want more behind the scenes leadership. I want radio and record company and booking agency, if we ever get to go outside to concerts again, right? Mm-hmm. It's got to also be behind the scenes. One of the great lessons of the Black Power era and then of the hip hop era is that it is easier for Black folks to control the cultural side of culture if they control the economic and infrastructural side. And even though that can be very complicated, and I'm not saying that the answer is for just Black folks to own everything, because that gets into some complicated economic stuff and other things, but there is no doubt that greater Black control over Black culture creates more opportunities for Black artists to be given those opportunities. I have a third thing very briefly, which is we got to tell a better story. We got to tell the history more accurately. We've got to tell the story of the present more accurately. That is something that I've certainly tried to do for years, and a lot of folks have tried to do, and you're clearly doing with this amazing research that you've done, this conversation, and the musicians are trying to tell us to do it, and I think it's happening. I would never have imagined 5 years ago that we'd be where we are now, in a good way. And when Lil Nas X happened and this all was going on last year, I was just astonished at how much the conversation was changing. And I hope that continues to happen because the music's better when that happens.
You said that a better story needs to be told about modern country music. What are some of the elements that you think are missing from the story that's being told about modern country music?
I think we need to change the entire way that we talk about the influence of Black music on country. In terms of, we need to stop talking about the ways that white artists are doing Black music. And I don't mean that because we need to stop talking about appropriation. We absolutely need to keep talking about appropriation. But we need to stop acting as though there's something miraculous about white people incorporating Black music. And that's part about talking more about the Black artists and the other non-white artists who are working in country music and working adjacent to country music, and stop treating Black music like the influence and white music like the product, right? And the final thing I would say is that, and this is something where I really am so thankful for the work of a lot of younger writers and artists and other people, is that the binary, I think as important as it is to lift up and amplify the importance of Black artists and Black audience members and the Black past and present in country, we really do need to talk more on a wider level about Latinx influences and artists contemporarily, Native and Indigenous, Asian and Asian American, and think not only about how those artists are part of the mix, but also what happens to the history when we understand that. And how do we understand country music if we think about, for example, Indigenous artists on reservations as part of the country mix? What does it mean to have Mexican country, right? Or Spanish language country, right? Again, the music only gets better when we think about that. So those are just a couple of examples about what I think we need to keep thinking about in terms of finding new ways to think about the present by connecting it to a different understanding of the past.
Well, thank you so much. This was such an interesting conversation. This is my last question. As you know, the podcast is curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. It's your last night on Earth. Where are you eating?
Ooh, that's a tough question. Wow. There was a restaurant that I used to go to in Madison, Wisconsin, where I lived for a decade. Still there, I think, although who knows right now with everything in danger. But it's called Nick's Diner, and it's right downtown. And it was just a place that I would go to a lot with various groups of friends and people I was close to. It was one of those places that felt like home. The food was good. It wasn't anything special, but it was good food, and the drinks were good, and just had a good jukebox, the whole thing. And I think if I had one last night on Earth, I would want to recreate that experience, because to me, so much of what makes eating out or eating as a communal experience such a powerful thing is the experience, not just the food. So even though I may have had better meals in my life than I would get there, I think I would probably go there and enjoy that space one more time.
Thank you for listening to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Icon Dinner, and on the Iconoclast Dinner Experience Facebook page. Let us know what you thought about this episode. Hit us on socials or send us feedback at press@iconoclastdinner.com. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to our podcast, and we'd also love it if you rated and reviewed us.